My name is Bethany DeMin. I'm the Student Interns and Lectures Coordinator here at FRC. For those of you watching online, welcome. We're glad you're with us. Just a reminder to all of you and to those of you watching online that these videos of the lectures will be archived on our website. So keep an eye out for those if you want to share them in your various social media circles. We really appreciate that. We find that greatly increases our reach. We're thrilled to have FRC's President, Tony Perkins, here with us today to introduce our speaker, Senator Mike Lee. Tony?
Thank you, and welcome to everyone. Glad you're here this afternoon for this very important lecture. I had the privilege of introducing, I think probably the only senator that's not running for president. Is certainly one of our heroes on Capitol Hill, one that I've come to know well over the last several years, working very closely with on a number of issues that are of great concern to us. None of which are of more concern than what we're going to talk about today. This issue became very prominent during the oral arguments in April before the Supreme Court on the case regarding same-sex marriage, in which the Solicitor General was asked by Justice Alito as to whether or not institutions of higher learning would be in jeopardy in terms of their tax exemption if, in fact, the court were to redefine the institution of marriage. And you probably all are familiar with the comments made by the Solicitor General, first trying to skirt the question, but then knowing that he could not, said, it is going to be an issue, Justice Alito, it is going to be an issue. Well, in fact, it is an issue now that the court has redefined marriage. But just days before the Supreme Court, in this very divided decision of 5-4 with four justices writing strong dissents, Senator Mike Lee of Utah and Raul Labrador of Idaho both introduced legislation to clarify and strengthen religious liberty protections in federal law. They have introduced the First Amendment Defense Act in the House. It is H.R. 2802. In the Senate, it is S. 1598. And this has been in the works for some time because we're seeing this happening both the state level and the federal level. In particular, it's very clear, and I'm sure the senator will go through what this measure does, but I want to make clear from the outset, this is simply keeping the federal government from being used as a weapon against its own citizens based upon someone's view of marriage. It would prevent any federal agency from denying a tax exemption, grant, contract, license, or certification to an individual, association, or business based on their view that marriage is the union of a man and a woman. And I would add that that's the same view that the president had just 3 years ago. Senator Lee has long been an outspoken supporter and advocate for religious freedom. He has gained a reputation as an outstanding practitioner of law based on his sound judgment and ability in the courtroom and through his understanding of the Constitution. In fact, earlier this year, he authored a book that was released entitled Our Lost Constitution, The Willful Subversion of America's Founding Document. And I will say I've got a lot of great friends in the Senate. We've got some true conservative heroes. But this is a true scholar of the Constitution and a defender of the Constitution, and we are privileged to welcome today Senator Mike Lee of Utah. Senator, welcome.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thanks to all of you for being here to talk about this very important issue. Tony is correct in that most of the people I work with are running for president. I never thought I would live to see the day that I would be able to say that 3 of my very favorite coworkers are all running for president at the same time, and that creates some awkwardness. I assume most people don't have to deal with that in their job, but I guess I've chosen a job with some unique occupational hazards presented by it. It's an interesting time to be sure. It has been said that if India is the world's most religious nation and Sweden is the world's least religious nation, that America can be likened to a nation of Indians governed by Swedes. We have to be concerned about an official orthodoxy in Washington, D.C., one emanating out into the rest of the country, this vast expanse between Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles that we call America, is inhabited by peace-loving men and women who want to be able to live and worship and believe as they see fit, want to be able to do so free of any retaliation by their government based on their religious beliefs. Their religious beliefs shouldn't have to pass any particular government approval test, and yet that is the kind of risk that we face. The inspiration behind this legislation was drawn in some ways from President Obama himself, who shortly after the Supreme Court issued its decision in the Windsor case invalidating portions of the Defense of Marriage Act, the president made a comment that I actually found quite helpful. He said, look, I have no desire to try to force any church to perform a same-sex marriage contrary to its religious teachings. I thought that's great. I'm glad to hear that. That is one of those things that shouldn't have to be said. It's sort of like walking past somebody on the street. You might be a little bit alarmed if somebody comes up to you when you walk past them on the street and says, by the way, I don't intend to kidnap you. It shouldn't have to be said, but nonetheless, if you hear that, I suppose you can take some comfort in hearing it. But the thought kept occurring to me that his statement was in some ways incomplete, as his statement in some ways needed to be backed up by law. If in fact he means that, then we ought to back up his statement by law, guaranteeing that no church will be forced to perform a same-sex marriage contrary to its teachings, and no American will have to embrace the religious beliefs that would entail such an ordinance. It's not just the forcing, in that it's not just the physical coercion that would go into forcing someone to perform a same-sex marriage. You can imagine all kinds of pressure that can be mounted by the world's most powerful government on religious belief that might end up indirectly bringing about the same thing. John Marshall famously said that the power to tax is the power to destroy. Through its immense power of taxation and regulation, the federal government can put pressure on churches, on religious entities, and on religious individuals to indirectly bring them to a particular place that they might not otherwise be willing to go, that they might not be interested in going, and that their religious teachings would otherwise caution them against going. It's interesting that in the immediate wake of the Supreme Court's ruling on June 28th, we started to have some people who were openly calling for the kinds of things that we've been fearing. Tony referred a few minutes ago to this exchange between Justice Alito and Solicitor General Donald Verrilli, President Obama's chief appellate advocate, his chief lawyer before the Supreme Court, in which Solicitor General Verrilli openly acknowledged, yes, Justice Alito, this is going to be a problem, reiterating this 3 or 4 times. A lot of us had worried about that exchange and what it signaled. We didn't necessarily anticipate how quickly this push would come. And yet, within days after the Supreme Court issued its ruling, you had people openly calling for exactly that. Now, Mark Oppenheimer, who's a columnist for the New York Times, wrote an article in Time magazine just days after the Supreme Court issued its ruling, in which he said the following: rather than try to rescue tax-exempt status for organizations that dissent from settled public policy on matters of race or sexuality, we need to take a more radical step. It's time to abolish or greatly diminish their tax-exempt status. So they wasted no time in going there. They went there. Now, it's interesting that he was talking about settled public policy on matters of race or sexuality, especially given that these supposedly settled public policy on matters of race or sexuality, these issues, this particular issue, had been quote-unquote settled for only about 48 hours by the time he wrote this. And they had been settled not by an overwhelming vote of the people throughout America. They had been settled not through elected lawmakers, but through 9 lawyers wearing robes 5 of whom agreed that this would be settled policy, not on the basis of clear text of the Constitution, but based on their own analysis, in my opinion, based on their own policy preferences. And yet he's very eager to bulldoze over another religious protection, freedom of religion, one that actually is contained in the Constitution, willing to allow people who want to exercise that particular right to bulldoze over their rights in the interests of preserving this new right recently recognized by the Supreme Court and put forward on the American people. There is a difference of opinion among Americans about whether or not the Supreme Court's ruling was the right one. I understand that there are a lot of people who like that ruling. There are those who believe that it is compelled by the Constitution itself. I don't agree with them, but I understand that that is their viewpoint. There is a wide divergence of opinion as far as what people would prefer if definitions of marriage were still handled at the state level, as they historically have been and as they would continue to be, but for this ruling. There is, however, a very strong consensus among the American people behind the idea that the government ought not punish people who believe for religious reasons that marriage is between a man and a woman, that the federal government ought not be preferring those who hold one view over another, and certainly ought not be punishing those who still, for religious reasons, abide by the definition of marriage that has been in place not just for many years or decades or centuries, but for many, many millennia. We have to remember that when we're talking about religious freedom, our religious freedom is only as strong as our willingness to restrain government remains intact. In other words, on many, many occasions when government tramples on religious freedom, in some cases, it might do so intentionally, deliberately, knowingly. In other cases, it might do so just recklessly. When government gets big, when it gets powerful, when it gets undisciplined and unrestrained, it tramples on religious freedom. As I've said on other occasions in the past, sometimes the kind of trampling on religious freedom that occurs within government can be likened to Godzilla. When Godzilla steps on your house, he's not always doing so because he hates you and he's targeted and singled out you for destruction. He's not necessarily stepping on your house because he wants to eat you and you in particular for lunch. In many cases, he just steps on your house because he's Godzilla and he's huge and your house happens to be in his way. It happens to be there. It's one of the reasons why we need protections for religious freedom. Unless we decide at the outset that we're going to protect it, big government, Godzilla, might end up finding your religious beliefs in its path. This is one area where we can see the path of Godzilla, and it's headed right for your house, right for your house of worship. We want to make sure that it doesn't trample it, and that's why we need this provision. The First Amendment Defense Act is a very reasonable, rational, carefully drawn protection that would simply say that the government cannot target you, cannot single you out, cannot punish you or your church or a religious institution based on a religious belief that marriage is between a man and a woman. And so regardless of how you feel about marriage personally, I suspect that most, if not all in this room, can respect the fact that in a pluralistic society like ours, we need to be able to respect each other's religious beliefs. And certainly your government ought to be able to do the same. Certainly we ought to hold the government to that same standard. To those of us who belong to religious minority groups, we can certainly see the need to do this. I belong to a church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which, as far as I know, is the only church, the members of which have been ordered exterminated during U.S. history. In the 1840s, Governor Lilburn Boggs of the state of Missouri ordered that the Mormon people be driven from the state or, if necessary, exterminated. Fortunately, we live in a day and age where there's a lot more respect for religious freedom than Governor Boggs exhibited way back then. We need never to return to those days when that kind of discrimination can occur. One of the ways that we can protect against that is by making sure that decisions like these, that religious beliefs regarding the sanctity of marriage and the definition of marriage, will be respected by the federal government and will not be the subject of retaliation. I appreciate each of you for your willingness to listen to me on this, and would invite all within the sound of my voice who agree with me on these issues to speak out. Contact your senators and your representatives and make sure that they know about this important legislation and ask them to support it. We have 37 senators who have signed on to the legislation. I think we've got about 135 representatives in the House. That's still not enough. We still need more, and every little bit of support really helps. So if you agree with me, please join me in this noble cause to protect religious freedom. Thank you very much.
We're going to take 3 questions now. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and our helper, Jonathan, will come to you. So raise your hand if you have any questions.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. My name is Grace Lee. I'm an intern right now at American Enterprise Institute. My question is, I know that there are similar bills that were introduced before like this, and they haven't had much success. I was wondering what your thoughts were on kind of this bill being passed and signed by the president.
Okay. I'm not sure which bills you're referring to. This is the only bill like this one that I'm aware of. Now, in the last Congress, we did introduce an earlier version of this bill. It did not pass, but I believe that recent events, namely the Supreme Court's decision from just a few weeks ago, have drawn much-needed public attention to this issue, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's gaining a lot more support now. I mean, just in the last few weeks, we've added dozens of additional co-sponsors. And I think that's in part because of what we've seen in the wake of the Supreme Court's ruling.
Senator, thanks so much. Could you outline specifically the key provisions or the main points of FADA?
Yeah. I'm happy to. Here's the basic gist of it. It says that the federal government may not retaliate, may not take any retaliatory action, may not take any adverse action against an individual or an entity based on a religious belief held by that individual or embraced by that entity that marriage is between a man and a woman. We specifically identify several things that would be encompassed within that, including but not limited to the removal of tax-exempt status, the removal of academic accreditation, the stripping of a government contract, for example.
Senator Stuart Schaefer from Liberty Center for Law and Policy. There's a similar bill, just the converse, put forth by Senator Gillibrand, I believe, and I was wondering how you could distinguish how hers hides behind the facade of providing more adoptions to same-sex couples, and how she hides behind the fact that she says it will give families, provide more families and lower the amount of children waiting for adoption, and how she discredits the fact that it takes away religious freedom. Could you distinguish?
Yeah, I guess I'm not familiar with Senator Gillibrand's bill. I didn't realize she had filed a similar bill. Can you tell me more about it?
I think it's S 1382, and it's I think it's the Act to defend children in adoption. I believe children in adoption.
Do you know what it does?
The exact right now, and I think it has 21 co-sponsors in the Senate. The exact thing that it does is it says that adoption agencies can no longer discriminate against any couples based off of their sexual orientation or sexual identity, and adoption agencies cannot deny adoptions to those couples, whether they're Christian or not.
And it makes no exception for a religiously affiliated
No exception.
group facilitating that. Interesting. It's the first I've heard of it. I'm happy to have a look at it, but anything that operates in the manner that you describe would be especially troubling to me if it didn't contain any kind of carve-out for based on religious belief.
Great. Thanks you all for coming today. Senator, is a tight schedule. We got to get him out of here. But can you all give him one last round of applause and we'll get started.